Welcome everyone again to another episode of the ideaXme show that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world and inspiring the future and future creators, and for all those like really great stories. Ira Pastor here, you're a life science ambassador along for this journey. So in the 1990 science fiction novel Jurassic Park, written by Michael Crichton, we follow the course of a fictional genetic engineering startup in Palo Alto, California, known as International Genetic Technologies, or InGen, which has discovered a method for cloning dinosaurs using the blood extracted from mosquitoes trapped in amber during the Mesozoic era. So that era of geologic time, somewhere between 66 and 252 million years ago, comprising your Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. And I'm sure that many of viewers and listeners that are familiar with that amazing franchise that was spawned from this novel. And I think many may be aware that 30 years into this franchise, that ultimately tracking down the blood of dinosaurs in this fashion and accomplishing it, the biotechnological feats of Dr. Henry Wu, the chief geneticist of Jurassic Park, is a bit remote. DNA sequences that that are usable and readable for cloning purposes probably don't survive more than 1 million years or so. But what about a different approach? So on previous episodes, we have independently talked about a range of themes, from the topics of microevolution to that of the physiological dynamics of how biologic form is established, to the unique genomics of regenerative organisms like amphibians. We've also dabbled a little bit in some science fiction topics. We've talked about head transplantation, astrobiology, cryonics, little bleeding edge type thinking. Today, we're going to merge it all together. I'm honored to be joined today by Dr. Dana Rashid. Dr. Rashid is Assistant Research Professor of Cell Biology and Neuroscience at Montana State University. With a PhD from University of California, Davis, Dr. Rashid is an evolutionary biologist who, in addition to studying the dynamics such as tail evolution that occurred between dinosaurs and birds over the last 150 million years, to the mutation events that ultimately allowed for these transitions to occur. She also oversees the Dino-chicken lab, which was established originally by paleontologist Jack Horner, author of How to Build a Dinosaur, with ultimately the goal of taking living descendants of the dinosaur, we know them as chickens, and reverse genetically engineering them to reactivate some of their ancestral traits, things like teeth, tails, even hands, to potentially one day create a chickenosaurus. But in addition to this sort of consumer biologic angle, as it's referred to in the original book, there are many fascinating human biomedical learnings to come off such work related to diseases where disruption of biologic form, for instance, say in the case of the inflammatory disorder Ankylosing spondylitis, a devastating condition, can ultimately, we can ultimately look in this knowledge base for potential treatments and cures. So all that being said, Dr. Dana Rashid, thank you for taking the time when you schedule to come on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure. I wanted to start off, as we usually do, by giving you the floor for a little while, just to talk about yourself, introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, where you grew up, how you got interested in evolutionary biology, and ultimately what brought you to this fascinating intersection between evolutionary biology and paleontology.
Well, I guess I would have to say I've never not been, it might surprise you to hear that I actually came from a conservative religious family,
Okay.
which is a bit antithetical to this project. But, I was one of those kids who I dissected everything, like bugs, dead animals. I had a cactus garden where I grafted stuff into different parts of cactus plants. I was always really interested in the natural world and how it works. And so I guess it's no great surprise that I ended up as a scientist. And I started off actually in Indra Verma's laboratory at the Salk Institute as a technician right after undergrad, and Indorama was an incredibly supportive and wonderful mentor for me. And I went from there to a couple of different graduate programs. I was introduced to developmental biology and protein biochemistry and molecular biology. Came here to Montana to do protein biochemistry, but ended up getting more involved in developmental biology. And then, of course, I met Jack Horner, and he had this rather nutty project of sort of recapitulating dinosaur traits in birds.
Mm-hmm.
I'll admit, I was skeptical at the beginning of this project. I didn't, I thought it could have some real potential, and I wanted to see where it would lead.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's turned me, and Jack actually has turned me into a better scientist throughout the entire process. I've learned to look at scientific questions in a different kind of a way.
Mm-hmm.
And we're learning these amazing things about key evolutionary events that happened
Mm-hmm.
for birds in their path from non-avian dinosaurs to avian dinosaurs and the rest. We're figuring out how some of those things are happening. And then what we didn't expect, but what we sort of hoped for, was that things that we could learn from these evolutionary events could then be applied to human disease. And we have actually found that that's really the case, which we're very excited about. So I'm sort of a jack of all trades of scientists, which has turned out to be fairly useful for this project because we do all kinds of wide-ranging things. And it's been the most fun I have ever had in science. Absolutely.
Well, that's nice to hear, because you have to have fun while doing this. But yeah, I can imagine being at the epicenter of all these different disciplines. Sort of the convergence of it all is probably mind-blowing and a really fun thing to get up and do every day. So
Yeah,
I'm envious
absolutely.
in that context. One of the areas that you've lectured about, I watched some of your presentations online, is this principle that we've talked about on other shows a bit, and I think sometimes it gets overlooked, but it's really so sort of fundamental to all areas of sort of biosciences, and that is form. This principle that sort of the shape and structure of something, how it evolves from its component parts, which isn't always a direct thing. And whether we're talking about disease or birth defects or development, this core principle of how we don't find form per se in a specific gene that says my hand should look like this, but in these sort of these complex networks of genes and so forth. You've been very focused on studying these dynamics as they occur from the transition from basically how that tail in the dinosaur that was long and had nerves and bones and so forth ultimately evolved into that feathery thing on the back of a bird that's not really a tail, it's just some long feathers. And surprising to you, you mentioned this, it's not as complex as you might think. Even though hundreds of millions of years or whatever, millions have gone by, there are some discrete steps that you have been able to focus on and that maybe shortcut the process. Can you talk a little bit about some of those findings and how surprising that whole concept was to you in terms of what was involved there in getting from reptile to bird?
Right. Well, birds used to have long reptilian-like tails. And there are certainly fossil birds that we find from the Cretaceous period with these long tails with 20, 30 vertebrae in them, for example. And they've gone from that form to the current form, which is a shortened tail, fewer numbers of vertebrae, and then the vertebrae at the end are all fused up into a structure called the pygostyle. And of course, there had to have been changes in musculature and nervous system and all of these sorts of accompanying structures that go with your skeleton in this process. And so when we started looking at the tail, I mean, one of the first things that we found out, which was a surprise, most of this project has been a surprise.
I'm sure it has.
I assumed that that the formation of this pygosyle, the fusion of these elements at the end, would have happened earlier in development, for example, before these structures even became bone. And when we do science, we have to have approved animal protocols, right? And so I was waiting for an approved animal protocol to look at these later sort of events in chicken development. And I thought, well, at least I can look at older chickens. I went down to the supermarket. I bought a roaster chicken. I dissected out the tail, and lo and behold, it looked like these bones were not fused at the end.
Okay.
And so I thought, there must be some mistake. There's something wrong with this chicken. I think I'll go and get another couple of supermarket broiler chickens, roaster chickens. And sure enough, it turns out that the fusion of these vertebrae and the formation of this kind of important structure, it doesn't happen until birds are near skeletal maturity, not till they're about 4 months old. And so it's not such an early developmental event at all. And so what we're discovering now is we just got some data, and once again, it's a complete surprise. And it shouldn't have been a surprise. But it looks like it's the immune system.
Wow.
So
Okay.
it's actually the immune system in the bird, which is causing these vertebrae to fuse at the very end. It's an immune system mediated event. And there's kind of there's a relatively new field, osteoimmunology, where scientists are really recognizing that the immune system is playing a huge role in bone biology. And this is no exception. And so what we thought was one event, some early cartilage event in development is not the case at all. It seems to be the case with lots of my hypotheses that they turn out to be wrong.
Okay.
But I mean, the real biology is far more interesting. And so it's an immune event, and every modern bird that we know of makes this structure. Whether all of them form the structure in the exact same way is debatable, because another thing that we have a paper in review right now, we looked at emus, which is, so there are 3 sort of major groups of birds. There are the neo-aves, which include hawks and owls and parakeets and all kinds of other birds, are the largest group. And then there are the gallo and seriforms, which are like ducks and chickens and pheasants, turkeys. And then there's this last group, the paleognathous birds. And these they exhibit the most ancestral traits to non-avian dinosaurs, I would say. They're considered like the most basal off of the bird tree. And their genetics is actually fairly different from other birds. They're a really interesting group. So when we looked at development in emus, for example, the development of their spinal nerves in their tails is completely different from other birds. And it raises the question of whether these birds actually came from a different long-tailed ancestor from other birds. It's a possibility, a distinct possibility, which is really, really interesting. evolution of birds is a lot more complicated, I think. But like the most conservative interpretation of the fossil record is that there was just a single line of birds, and they all came from like the same long-tailed ancestor, and there was a single sort of event that shortened that tail and gave rise to a pygostyle. But we find that it's actually really a fairly simple. It doesn't take a lot to shorten a tail. It doesn't take a lot to fuse up vertebrae. There are lots and lots of mutations that will cause these sorts of things. And so I think there's a greater possibility that these events happened in different groups.
Okay.
and that what we see as birds today came from different long-tailed ancestors, and it's kind of fascinating. We're looking at different kinds of dinosaurs, is what I think.
That's
when
really
we're
cool.
looking at birds. It's really an interesting thing to conceptualize.
Yeah.
I would have to say. But anyway, yeah, as far as form and mutations and everything else, and how evolution happens, these are all questions which, lots and lots of scientists are addressing all these kinds of questions. We look at mice, for example. We have thousands and thousands of mice, of transgenic mice, where they've been genetically modified so that we can actually change a gene, get rid of a gene, or change its expression or whatever, and then look to see what happens. And we have an amazing, I guess, toolkit. Not just mice, but then like mice are great to look at all kinds of biology, but we have other organisms too. We look at alligators to look at their development. What are the sorts of processes which are consistent in vertebrates across a whole range of vertebrates, not just mice or not just birds. We like to get a big picture of events of form and function and genetic change, I'd have to say.
Really cool. Really neat. You just stimulated something in my mind, so I'll put this on my list. But before we get to chicken dinosaurs and so forth, take us a little bit into the path of then the sort of some of the human parallels here, because I mean, you mentioned some of your work, ankylosing spondylitis, and sort of the fusion component of those bones, and how there may be interesting parallels between that particular work and then human health. The other thing it made me think about when you're talking about alligators now, as we get into some of the regenerative dynamics that we see in some in reptiles, mainly amphibians, but we do see it in the alligator tail. Regeneration, because here we have, this tail is, in many ways like a limb. It's got everything. It's got bone, muscle, nerves, all sorts of stuff going on. Are there interesting regenerative learnings, for instance, that could potentially be applied for humans in some of these sort of this gene expression work and understanding what's going on between sort of birds, which really don't have a lot of regenerative capability, and stuff below it where we do see we do see some decent regenerative capabilities.
Yeah, regenerative medicine is a huge field. It's not it's not my field. I can make some comments on it. Of course,
Sure,
I think
please.
it has a tremendous amount of potential to help people for like spinal cord injuries or whatever. If there is some way to apply the things that we learn from regenerative sort of animals that are capable of regeneration and apply that to these sorts of things, these sorts of problems. I mean, what a tremendous, it's a tremendous potential,
Right.
I would have to say. So if people talk about regeneration sometimes in lizard tails, it's not quite the same. Lizards can sometimes drop their tails to confuse predators. They'll drop a tail which can still wiggle, and the predator goes after the fallen tail. The rest of the lizard scurries away. People have asked me about that, certainly. The tail that that regrows in the lizard is not quite the same. It doesn't have vertebrae and other sorts of aspects to it. But certainly for regenerative medicine, and people look at this particular thing as well as other animals which are better at regeneration. And it's, yeah, like I said, it's not my field, but I have great hopes for it.
Yeah.
I have great hopes for it, absolutely, you know, for medicine and just understanding biology in general.
But as far as ankylosing spondylitis, tell us a little bit about that, like what you're looking at there in terms of the parallels.
All right, well, when we started to understand that it looked like the immune system was involved in the fusion of these bones at the end of the bird tail. And basically what we first saw, we did a whole histology series. So we took chicken tails from a whole bunch of different ages of chickens. We sliced them up, we stained them, we followed the progression of events during that fusion process. And we saw an influx of these immune cells into the space. And this was unexpected. And then we asked, well, is there another example in the animal world where we see fusion of vertebrae and related to the immune system?
Okay.
And of course we do. We see it in a disease, a human disease called Ankylosing spondylitis. And so over 90% of people who have this disorder have a particular genetic change. It's called HLA-B27 allele. And it kind of, I think what it does is it gives them sort of overactive immune system. And so lots and lots of studies have been directed toward obviously helping people who have this condition and understanding the biology behind it, because it's about 1 in 120 or 140 people who have this disorder, and it is fairly debilitating. So the big question was like sort of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? So there's all this inflammation.
Good question.
And is it just inflammation which is driving this whole process, or is it something else? And because we come from a different evolutionary perspective, we ask a different question. So we ask, so when does the fusion of these vertebrae occur in humans in their lifespan? And does that correlate with any kind of particular normal developmental event? And what we see is a lot of these cases happen in juveniles. And there's our theory is there's a very particular event that happens in your intervertebral discs during your normal development. And these discs, they start off as fairly robust sort of structures, this nucleus pulposus structure in your disc. But it starts to decline in your juvenile state. The cells switch over to a different kind of cell type. You lose vasculature. And we think that this event we think it's happening the same in birds as it is in humans. And it brings in the immune system, right? And because humans who have this HLA-B27 allele have an overactive immune system. I think it's causing these vertebrae to fuse, and it's the same mechanism in both cases. The other thing that we discovered, so this particular structure of this nucleus pulposus, supposedly there's papers out there that say that birds don't have it, but they actually do. So we made this kind of discovery. Birds actually have this structure. We're looking to see, and it's formed from your notochord in an early embryo. So we want to follow, we have another side project where we're following the notochord in different vertebrates to see what happens, how conserved the formation of this nucleus pulposus structure is across other vertebrates. But anyway, in humans and birds, we think that its decline is responsible for this disease, and it brings in the immune system. The immune system brings in all of these different cytokines, cell signaling. We think there's conversion of cell type from a chondrocyte type cell to an osteoblast type cell. So it goes from a cartilage cell to a bone cell, and in that process forms bone.
Mm-hmm.
And we think, yeah, it's all related to this. But I mean, finding triggers for disease, I mean, it's difficult. This disease can strike people just about any age, but
Sure.
at the same time, your nucleus pulposus is continuously deteriorating from the time you're about 10 years old until you die. So your immune system could be activated by this event at any time in your life. And so we think it's all related to this particular structure and normal development, which basically goes awry in an overactive immune system.
Mm-hmm.
And it's conserved, and it's responsible in one case for an important evolutionary adaptation in birds, and then in the other case for humans, it's pathological.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which all of these things help us once again understand form and relationship of genetics to form.
Yep.
Yeah.
Really neat. So take us over to the Dino-chicken project. Where does it currently sit? What are the next steps with it? And then obviously, if $1 billion fell down from the sky tomorrow, where you would go with it? And then, just as a side part to that, and I'll give you back the floor. I don't know if you read the original novel, Jurassic Park.
Of course.
But, okay, I'm sure you do. I don't know how many people that watch the franchise, but the lead scientist, this Henry Wu character, who doesn't really have too much of a role in the movie, he's a really interesting character. And he's a true out-of-the-box thinker, and, he's interested in lots of stuff, but, he wants to move quickly and get things done. And, always a rate-limiting step in this industry, in anything, whether it's drugs or agricultural products or baby dinosaurs, it's money. But if the magical sums would just appear, tell us take us out a little bit to the future. It's one of the most fascinating things I've heard about. It's science fiction, but it's not, because you really have a back door here into doing some really fascinating things. Where would you go with it? Where are you going to take it if money was no object?
Well, I can start with the first part of your question. We can talk about sort of the history
mm-hmm.
of the project.
Please do.
And so Jack Horner, he was fascinated by this book as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he thought, what a fantastic idea. Exactly. What a fantastic idea. Why don't we try to make non-avian dinosaurs out of avian dinosaurs, right? Jack himself is, he's a pioneer in paleontology in many ways.
Okay.
So he was the first to recognize baby dinosaurs. So you think these are simple concepts, but at the time people were discovering all of these fossils, and people didn't understand what was a baby, or a young juvenile as opposed to an adult, and so we're still correcting this, but lots of fossils were accorded their own unique species when it turned out that lots of them were just a juvenile of an otherwise known species.
Okay.
Right? And so, and Jack really promoted this concept, and he also promoted cutting up these bones and looking at them, doing this sort of histology and understanding the biology and the age of these organisms that they were actually looking at. And so initially, right, people would have these fossils and they were precious, and everyone would just wanted to just look at them. Let's just mount them and we'll just look at them from the outside.
Yeah.
That's all we really should do because they're too precious. And Jack said, that's ridiculous. We need to just cut them up, look at every little possible thing that we could look at in them to understand them, right? And and so this Dino-chicken project is just another of his goals, and he had several goals for this. And his I'm going to say probably his primary goal is to teach the public about evolution and about biology, and about the wondrous, incredible world that we live in, that we so much take advantage of, but don't always sit down and really appreciate how it is the way that it is.
Okay.
And there are a lot of misconceptions in the world.
Sure.
Absolutely. And so he could say, look, here we are. Here's this dino-chicken. It looks like a non-avian dinosaur. We follow the principles of evolution to create this thing. And how can you possibly then say that evolution is not true? So that's part of his incentive for doing this sort of thing. And of course, people love dinosaurs, right? Oh my gosh, and kids love dinosaurs. And he sort of understands that to change people's thinking, it's best to start when they're young. Because by the time they're older and set in their ways, the ability for a person to change their mind is sometimes not as simple as it is to teach children.
Sure.
So he even he's written children's books and everything on dinosaurs and stuff. So anyway, so he was really intrigued by this idea that came from the Jurassic Park movie. And in fact, he has consulted on the Jurassic Park movies. He's greatly contributed to these movies in different ways. He's been frustrated that he can't put feathers on them, but but you know, that's Hollywood.
That's Hollywood, yeah.
Right. Some things are just not quite right, but you know, that's still interesting. So anyway, he also, you know, Jack is a scientist, and he knows that if you take an out-of-the-box approach to something, you are probably going to learn a lot along the way.
Sure.
Which is exactly what has happened. We're like discovering all kinds of really, really interesting things about science, which apply to vertebrates in general, and humans, and disease, and evolution, and all this kind of stuff. Just by looking at tails. You think bird tails, you know, how interesting could that be? For me, at least, it's, you know, it's a day-by-day obsession. But yeah, but anyway, so the question was, you know, could you recapitulate some of these traits, and starting with the tail? And so where we have sat with this is that we've had to understand the tail biology and the evolution of the tail to begin with, before trying to manipulate it in some way. And that has turned out, I was surprised. I thought when I started this project, oh, for heaven's sakes, there must be gajillion papers on all of these processes. It's axial termination. It's like every vertebrate has to end its skeleton in some way. And I thought, we must know everything there is to know about it. I was completely wrong again. And we've just been finding so many things along the way, important biology along the way, that we've been concentrating on sort of characterizing the system and understanding it. And but we still would love to now manipulate this tail.
Yep.
So like there was the paper that came out where the study in mice, where they basically overexpress these two genes in this progenitor population of cells at the very end of the tail. So there's this population of cells,
Okay.
and from these cells at the end of the axial column is where everything comes from, right? So your vertebrae come from this, the musculature comes from this, the skin and everything, and there's this progenitor bunch of cells, and a lot of this is coming from, a lot of these structures are coming from this population. And we know that as the skeleton terminates, the axial column terminates in embryonic development, that those cells kind of die off. And so what this study did is they, by overexpressing these two genes, they maintained this population of progenitor cells, right? And so in so doing, these mice had really long tails. Which is awesome, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it tells us so much about the biology of axial termination and extension and all this kind of stuff. And so we would love to do this. And you might ask, well, what would we learn then? What could we learn from a chicken with a long tail? And there's actually a lot that we could learn from a chicken from a long tail. So a couple things that I'm really, really interested in. One is feather pattern. So we have these fossil birds with long tails, and they had these funky feather pattern to them. Some of them had like little, like fan-tailed feathers at the very, very end, but they otherwise had this frond type feather pattern down the length of their tails and stuff. And what happens to feathers? Because now there's just a single fan-tailed sort of feather configuration with modern birds. But if you made their tail really long, what would happen to their feathers? And then the other thing is when the tail was shortened, musculature had to change, especially a caudofemoralis muscle. So that normally would attach midway down the tail, right? But it had to change, and it now attaches to the pygostyle now, but it's sort of being lost in the process of bird evolution. But it helped to connect the tail movement to hindlimb movement. And so how does musculature change? If you now extend your vertebrae out, like what happens to all the musculature and where does it attach now? And then if you have a bird with a long tail now, does it move like a T-Rex? Does its gait and the way it positions itself, because it's going to have a different distribution of mass and everything else. And there actually was a paper where, it was from England, I think, where they actually stuck little weighted bars on the ends of little chickens. And they watched to see the change in gait and movement, locomotion of these creatures if they would have had a longer tail. And sure enough, at least with these weighted sort of fake tails stuck on these little birds, they ended up moving more down, exactly as we would predict like a T-Rex would have moved at the time. And so we can learn, and it sort of tells you sort of plasticity of organisms. We have mutation that goes on in different organisms, and it changes the various phenotypes of these organisms, and they have to adapt to them. So how do they adapt to them? And sometimes these changes sometimes a single genetic change can give you significant morphological change. Sometimes it's minor, sometimes it could be major, but how, what's the plasticity of organisms to adapt to a change which they otherwise wouldn't have been prepared for, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of these things we would be interested in,
Mm-hmm.
and just the importance of maintaining this progenitor population of cells. You talk about
Sure.
about how can you use biology to, for rejuvenation and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and these sorts of studies can help inform that type of science, which ultimately could help us in the long run.
Really neat. Really, really neat. If you got to the point where you succeeded with a chicken that had teeth and the tail and the little arms, or whatever the last thing looked like, and I'm just, because I'm a big fan of birds. I have a big parrot upstairs. I think he's pretty smart.
Yes, they are. I have one too. I used to have one. Yeah.
Cool. I like the people. I don't know, and I'm not trying to say reptiles stupid, birds smart, but in the movie, most of the dinosaurs are pretty average, except for the raptors, which they train and do all that stuff. Would this Chickenosaurus technically be smarter than your average dinosaur, in the sense that they have a bigger brain? Or I don't know much about. I assume their brain gets a little bigger when you move to birds, but yeah. Can you tell us anything about that? I just don't know much about how much smarter birds are than, say, alligators or whatever. But I just wondered. This is something I was just thinking about last night in lieu of our phone call.
Yeah, well, I think birds get a sort of a bad rap. You heard like bird brain and stuff.
Right.
Birds are actually quite smart.
Yeah. No.
And even pigeons and surprisingly even chickens. Some birds are smarter than others. If you have a parrot, you do have a very smart bird there.
Yeah.
And bird brains now are quite a bit larger than they were back in the Cretaceous period.
Okay.
So creatures in general seem to evolve smarts over time, I would have to say. And obviously some are smarter than others. We anthropomorphize things too, and what we consider to be smart versus not smart as well. But certainly a bird brain is going to be a lot bigger relative to body size than an alligator brain, right? And just about any bird today is probably going to be smarter than birds back in the Cretaceous period and dinosaurs back in the Cretaceous period. For the most part, their brains are definitely bigger, more convoluted. By those parameters, you would assume or hypothesize at least that they're smarter now than they used to be.
Neat.
So, but as far as changing any genetics in a bird now, and whether that could change its smarts, I guess you wouldn't know. It's one of those things where we have a pretty good idea of what a lot of genes do, for sure. And whether any particular change would lead to higher intelligence, for the genes that we would be looking at, it's probably not so likely, but I guess you would never know. It's one of those things where you wouldn't know until you did it.
Right? It's just, I'm up there and I tell, obviously he repeats stuff, but like I tell him to do stuff and, he'll get certain cues. And I'm just, I think that's that part of, the recent movies where, the guy's teaching the Raptors to do all sorts of stuff. And he teach the chicken to do some things for you. But it's just, as I said, it was a late night thought. And I was just intrigued by what might look like.
My parrot used to say things in context.
Yeah, so does ours.
Yeah, they say things in context, and they use, they can use tools and various sorts of things. And I think humans in general, we think we're oh so smart, but like an elephant can paint a picture of a flower and a picture of another elephant. I mean, oh my gosh. And it's not like we're the only animals that communicate with each other.
Right.
I mean, there's amazing different kinds of intelligence in just about every creature. Oh my gosh, like an octopus.
Oh yeah.
There's a creature that's like, holy cow, they're an enigma, right?
Right.
Because there was this sort of idea that, well, they don't live all that long, only a couple years, and so why would they develop any intelligence at all? And there was this idea that creatures that don't live very long are not going to develop intelligence. That's absolutely not true
Right.
at all. So intelligence is a very interesting parameter, and we as humans are not the only ones that exhibit it, I would say.
Yeah, no, I agree with that one, and reminded me that it was something. This is a side note. There was something on about octopuses a little while ago, and there was one, I don't forget what species it was, but it could pluck like a stinger off a jellyfish and use it like as a weapon. It was it was the weirdest sounding thing, but it was on NPR. I have to look that one up. Anyway, we'll get back. Sorry, get back to dinosaurs and things like that. I make it a habit of when I prepare for this show, I introduce my kids to the topic and the background of our guest, and I have them come up with or suggest some ideas to ask. And my kids are 17, 15, and 13 now, 2 boys and a girl. They were always into dinosaurs, and they still, dinosaurs are pretty cool. When I told them about you and what you do, and they thought it was all very cool. But then my one son, the older one, who's 17. There's this other franchise out now, this whole Megalodon thing, which has been in the movies. So he wanted me to ask you, and I don't know, this is too far off the scope, but he basically said, well, he understood what you're doing. That was interesting. That was good. But then he said, what about the megalodons? Isn't that just a bigger shark? And if she played around with sharks a bit, could she make a megalodon? So I don't know. So that's coming from Ira Pastor, age 17, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Let's give you that one.
Well, it turns out that there are lots of genes which affect body size.
Okay.
And body size has played a huge role in evolution. And they think that one of the reasons why some of the birds were able to make it past the KY extinction event, the big meteor which hit off of Yucatan Peninsula and killed off so many of the other dinosaurs. They think that maybe some of the reason why some of these birds could have survived was because of size, because they were made smaller in size.
Mm-hmm.
They were evolving to be smaller. That was one component that helped them survive that extinction event. So if you look at, for example, all of these mouse mutants that we have, there are lots and lots of mouse mutants, of mutations in mice, which make them smaller. Not a lot that make them bigger, but obviously creatures have gotten bigger and smaller in evolution. Dinosaurs started off they started off, I don't know, some medium size, and you end up with these huge like titanosaurs and everything else, and then the ones that end up surviving ultimately are just littler birds. But there are mutations which affect size, and so I've never heard of anybody trying to change the genetics of a shark, although we certainly changed the genetics of zebrafish, which is a genetic organism.
Yep.
And so what you would try to do, I guess, if you were going to try to make a giant megalodon, is you'd first mess around with zebrafish and try to figure out how to make them bigger and use, I don't know what, I'd have to look it up, like what sort of mutations might make them bigger, and see if you could apply that same sort of approach to a shark. I mean, this is the thing, is this is one big thing that is important to Jack Horner,
Mm-hmm.
is he wants people to understand just what we can do in science right now.
Yep.
I mean, it's incredible. It
Yep.
really, really is. And of course, we are constrained. We have ethics constraints. And of course, those are as important to me as any scientist.
Sure.
Um, but it is amazing what we have figured out. We are in the greatest scientific revolution that humans have ever seen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I feel so fortunate that I can take part of it in just some small way, right? But
Absolutely.
I feel like so many other people, and Jack feels this way too, like are missing out because, you know, we're not always, as scientists, we're not always good at telling the public what exactly it is that we do. We sequester ourselves in our little laboratories, and we do our little thing, and we write our papers, and we call it good. So dissemination of this kind of information just isn't really always out there. But we have the ability now to change just about any organism,
Mm-hmm.
and we have ways to change them in all kinds of different parameters.
Mm-hmm.
That's absolutely true. And the more that we have like gene editing tools like CRISPR-Cas9 and all of these sorts of tools, which they're changing the face of science. They're changing
Absolutely.
the face of biology. Absolutely. These things are all possible, and so that was like another, like I said, major incentive of Jack's to start this project in the first place was public education.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I will let my son know that after you succeed with the Chickenosaur and make your fortune, that you will donate a few $1 billion to the Megalodon project. And um, but getting back to you though, we typically have to ask a wrap-up question about important influencers in your career to date. And you mentioned some folks at the beginning that, you know, if it wasn't for them, Dr. Dana Rashid would be doing oncology research or law or something totally different. Anyone that you specifically want to highlight, give a shout out to, that really kept you on the path that you have been on throughout this course of your career?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, these other people who have influenced what I do, they're tremendous. And the first one was Inder Verma. You know, what a fantastic, he is a visionary himself. So he helped to pioneer genetic engineering. He was the first to discover long terminal repeats in viruses, and is an incredible scientist. You know, I had they've all been important. There was Steve Stricker, my master's advisor, who introduced me to developmental biology, and
Mm-hmm.
John Scully, my PhD advisor, who introduced me to protein biochemistry and taught me how to be really rigorous in science. Roger Bradley here at MSU, who really led me down the path of developmental biology, and of
Mm-hmm.
course, Jack, this
Yep.
incredible visionary who, like I said, has made me a better scientist than I was going into this project. And I have this huge appreciation for visionaries.
Mm-hmm.
And these days, it's not so easy to be a visionary.
No.
Absolutely not. There's so much flack. Oh my gosh. The people they say, hey, let's just do this thing. And it sounds crazy and completely out of the box. You know, here's Elon Musk, for example, say, let's
Mm-hmm.
make rockets that are, you know, that we can bring them back to Earth, recycle them. And oh
What?
my gosh, the difficulties that these people have, but they forge ahead, right? They have these amazing ideas, they forge ahead, and they move mountains. They change our boundaries of, you know, of what we understand and what we think we can actually do. And so it's definitely been a huge privilege to have worked with all of these people, and Jack especially. Like I said, I feel extraordinarily fortunate to have been part of this project and to have had my own science, just influenced
Mm-hmm.
by Jack. Absolutely.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Dana, it's been really eye-opening hearing your story and listening to your journey, everything you're doing, what you're going to do. It's truly fascinating, and I'm really wishing. I mean, I want to help you get that. As you said, it's all about getting the message out there. I want to help you get this message out as much as possible, so people can really see what you're doing and the sort of this legacy that you're continuing. Really fascinating. For everybody that's going to be watching on the YouTube channel or listening on the various podcast networks. We've been spending time with Dr. Dana Rashid, assistant research professor at Montana State University, in the lab of cell biology, neuroscience, evolutionary biologist extraordinaire, continuing the work that you'll find in this book, Pick It Up, How to Build a Dinosaur in the Dino-chicken Lab. Really, as we say, creating the future, inspiring the future, moving the human story forward and the dinosaur story forward. Thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to come along and share your knowledge. It's been amazing stuff.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It was absolutely a pleasure.